It's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce to you today's speakers. The co-founders of both Politico and Axios are Mike Allen and Jim VandeHei, and they are regarded as two of Washington's most influential and well-connected journalists. Their current venture, Axios, is a new media company delivering news and insights on politics, business, media, and technology. The Greek word axios means worthy, and Axios seeks to revolutionize, I want to add a syllable in there, revolutionize the way news is consumed in the 21st century, utilizing a forward-thinking approach that delivers information in a smart, efficient, trustworthy manner and without bias. In addition to starting Axios, Jim VandeHei was the co-founder and former CEO of Politico, a media phenomenon coined by the Washingtonian. And it's the all politics, all the time site that has been a smashing success since 2006 when it was launched. In his 9 years at the publication's helm, VandeHei was the chief architect of both the site's editorial and business models. Under his leadership, Politico expanded into New York and Europe, where it was recently named the most influential publication on the continent for top government officials. As a fellow co-founder and chief White House political correspondent at Politico, Mike Allen sought to carve out a niche in the marketplace by focusing on giving readers one solid takeaway from select stories. He was the founding father of the successful daily email tip sheet playbook, which quickly became the early morning must-read for movers and shakers in politics and media. The New York Times called Allen the man the White House wakes up to. And Vanity Fair said, reading Playbook is as close as you can come to a Washington morning to knowing everything. Both VandeHei and Allen have received numerous accolades for their political coverage. Their expertise as on-the-beat reporters, coupled with their entrepreneurial savvy, will provide us with an insight into what is really happening in Washington and how we are going to be consuming news in the 21st century. So, without further ado, the groundbreaking journalists and entrepreneurs who have upended and revolutionized traditional political reporting, join me in welcoming Mike Allen and Jim VandeHei. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Jennifer.
All right.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much, Jennifer, or as people around the country have been waiting to say, Madam President. So you heard Jennifer say that if you get a little too exuberant, as my grandma would say, you will be removed. My Forum Club sources say that in 45 years, that's never happened, so maybe someone will take that as a challenge. What a treat for us to be here with people who have such amazing life experience. We've had such a good time visiting, and people who care so much about this community, that amazing list of people who are both in office and running for office, and people who care so much about the world and what's going on. We thank Barbara Noble, the previous Madam President, and Sarah and Kevin, and all the people who've welcomed us here. The press made a lot of mistakes in 2016, but I think one of the biggest ones was we didn't listen enough. And so that's why we love being out in the community and connecting with the people in this room who, from all around the country, have had the most fascinating lives.
Echo Mike, it's great to be here. It's just awesome to see people who do care. I think one of the good side effects of this crazy moment in politics is that people seem more engaged. People care more passionately, and I think there's a big chunk of people who are trying to learn more about more topics, which is near and dear to our heart. Before I talk a little bit about the media, two quick funny stories. Congressman Foley is here, and now that he's not in office, I can disclose that he leaked me one of the most entertaining stories I ever wrote. This is so good. No, I tell this story all the time. So
That doesn't
he
make
comes.
it-
So I used to work. I was at the Wall Street Journal. I guess I was covering Congress, and I was in this like tiny little thing in the Capitol. And he comes up and he's got a great story for you. You get to talk to Clint Eastwood. And I was like, Clint Eastwood, like, come on. He's like, no, like Clint Eastwood, I guess at the time was, he has this place in Carmel, and trial lawyers were going around and they were suing places if they didn't comply with the Americans for Disabilities Act in hope of trying to leverage a settlement. And they made the mistake, I guess, of going after Clint Eastwood's place. And so he gives me his cell phone. I'm like, come on, this is Clint Eastwood's cell phone. So I call it, and it's like, it goes to a voicemail. It's like, it's Clint Eastwood. Leave a message. I'm like, come on, this can't be real. So I go home and I put it on speaker so like my wife and a couple friends who were over could listen. And I call him and he answers again. And he starts to talk like Clint Eastwood. He's like, Jim, I'm going to go after these sons of bitches. I'm like, you actually talk like that in real life? So it's like one of those rare stories that like writes itself. It was so good. I will swear, I'm from Wisconsin. I occasionally will swear every once in a while. Go Packers. So you put your earmuffs on if you don't like swear words, but I'm quoting other people. I'm going to tell one funny story. Because one of the questions that Mike and I get asked during the Q&A, the first card is always, like, when did politics go batshit crazy? And I'm like, I think we were there for the very moment. And it was, so before there was Donald Trump, there was Sarah Palin. And we used to write a column together at Politico. And in 2012, not only was she running, but she was leading in the polls. And so we did this column about how all the Republican establishment was freaking out. All the Bush people used lots of anonymous sources, which she didn't like. So she goes on Fox News and says, you know what, I want to use my anonymous sources to say that Jim and Mike are pieces of crap. Well, it gets better. Then she goes on Twitter and she tweets, I would like people to know, based on her anonymous sources, that Jim and Mike are homophobe, child molesting, tax evading, anti-dentite, puppy kicking, chain smoking porn producers.
It was the anti-dentite that got me.
Right. Yes, she said that, and yes, a few of you thought she should be president. So literally like a week after this, we do Morning Joe occasionally, and I was on it, and this is right after when Palin was running. Donald Trump was thinking of running at that point, and I was on the show, and I was talking about, like, come on, Donald Trump running as a Republican, he's like a super liberal guy, he's giving all this money to Hillary Clinton, this is nonsense. And I get a text right as I get off the set, and it's from Maggie Haberman, who's now at the New York Times, but worked for us at Politico, and she says, hey, the Donald was watching and wanted to pass along that he thinks you're a big piece of shit. Now he redeemed himself, or we redeemed ourselves, because we actually moved up the launch of Axios because we had an interview with him, and we've interviewed him a couple times and spent some time with him ever since. So on more serious topics, so Mike and I have been in journalism, and we're pretty traditional journalists, and that's kind of what we thought we were going to do for the rest of our lives. He was at Time Magazine, New York Times, Washington Post. I'd been at the Post and the Wall Street Journal and a few other publications. We actually met, true story, we met on the Lido deck of a cruise ship in Genoa, Italy, because remember back in the day there would be all these massive trade protests whenever the president would go anywhere. It'd be a dispute about the WTO, and like people would be like, it was getting so heated that they had nowhere to put the press, and so they brought in a cruise ship, and I met Mike at 4 o'clock in the morning on the Lido deck, and his first words to me were, for speed. And it turns out Mike likes to slam beer, and back in the day, so did I. And so the first thing we did to see who can drink a can of beer faster. I think Mike won. But now our passion. So then we became entrepreneurs in creating Politico, and now I guess two-time entrepreneurs in doing Axios. But we can be helpful to you is we spend a lot of time talking to political leaders. We also spend a lot of time. We interviewed Elon Musk, Bill Gates, lots of people in the tech space. We spend a lot of time with CEOs. We spend a lot of time with people thinking about all the things that are in collision with politics. And to me, you can't really understand politics today without understanding media. And I was sort of jotting a few things down this morning. Like, on the one hand, this moment should be information nirvana. Right? It should be information nirvana. This is all true. Rich or poor, you have access to more information about any topic facing humanity in any nation, about any nation, in text, audio, or video for free because of the internet. Everybody in this room has the ability to recall facts and figures that would make a Jeopardy champion blush thanks to Google for free. Any one of us can connect with 2.5 billion people that use Facebook to share news, information, photos for free. Any one of us can follow or sort of get inside the mind and musings of some of the most influential thinkers on Twitter for free. So we all should be getting smarter faster. So why is everyone getting dumber quicker? So it should, so you have on the one hand, it should be information utopia. And yet it feels like an information dystopia, right? And that, I think, is one of the reasons that we all feel so agitated. And the reason, one of the big reasons, is that all those things that do things so nicely for us, you also, any one of us, whether you're a nation state or some wacko in the basement, can spread misinformation, lies, propaganda for free, at scale if you put a little money behind it, without any consequence. Then you think about what's happening on these platforms. In 2018, Science magazine basically looked at every tweet ever sent on Twitter. And they found that fake, false information moved, let me quote this so I get it right. It moved deeper, where is it here? That it moved, falsehoods spread significantly farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every single category of information that it measured. On Facebook, in the final 3 months of the last election, fake stories reached more people than real stories from the 20 largest news organizations in America, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. Think about that. Most people got most of their news on Facebook, and most of it was fake. And of the 20 that had the biggest reach, 17 of them were either pro-Trump or anti-Hillary. It's one of the reasons that Trump, to this day, while everyone looks at what he does on Twitter and looks at what he does on TV, spends a hell of a lot more money than anybody on Facebook. He understands the power of Facebook. There's 120 million accounts right now on Facebook that are fake people. Fake. They're not real. They're called bots. A very similar percentage on Twitter. And so many people, including a lot of us in this room, blindly share the propaganda and the lies and the misinformation that these bots, often set up by foreign regimes, like throw into our system. And on top of that, you have, because of social media, because of sort of the moment that we live in, we just have politics like just thrown through a hose at us all day, every day, at a level that often isn't that healthy. I always use the example of, like, I like Doritos, but if I ate Doritos every single hour of every single day, I'd be a fat slob, right? It's just not healthy at some point to have too much of it. And now all these companies, all media, have such an incentive to throw more politics at you. And unfortunately, a lot of people who are engaging, they engage with it, they pick a side, and then they drift off into their own little soothing filter, their little bubble where people agree with what they have. So you have this, could have utopia, feels like dystopia. So what's going to happen is there's going to be, to me, I think to us, this thing that's going to happen, and it's kind of happening now, which is you're going to have information inequality. Right? Like, if you want dumb coverage, if you want reinforcing coverage, if you want to go down the rabbit hole of silliness or salaciousness, there's just tons of it. And you can, and you will. And so you have that choice, right? Like, you could do that, and that's what you see so many people around us doing. Or The people who are going to thrive in the coming decade are going to be the people that turn the internet, that turn these social platforms, that turn this moment into massive weapons of intellectual sort of reinforcement. Right? Like if you know what to read, if you know where to look, if you know how to stack your life, you're going to create almost a bionic mind. You're going to be so much smarter across more topics so you can make better decisions. And so to me, there's like 5 things that we can do, right? There's like, because people are always, well, what do I do? What do I do because of, like, what do I trust, right? 2 things are certain. Government's not going to fix this problem. Right? They're both, like, I would say, too slow, and I don't even know that they're that interested in getting to the sort of the fundamental problems facing these platforms. And the companies aren't going to fix the problem because it would run against their entire business model. And so in the short term, the only solution is you. It's us. And there's like 5 things that I think that any one of us could do. 1, you can find the sources that you know to be credible and only read those. Nothing drives me more mad than when people say, I read that on Facebook. Like, Facebook's not a publication, it's a pipe. And a lot of the stuff that goes through that pipe, it ain't good. It's not real. So, like, know what you're reading. There's all this good stuff out there. Figure out what you trust. If you feel like over time, whatever you're reading has a good track record of being right, like, you can probably trust that it's going to be right over time. 2, you can kill your social media feed. You can stop being on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat. But if you're not going to kill the social feed, just tailor it to use it for what it's good at, right? Like, Facebook is actually awesome for me to be able to keep up with what's happening with my nieces and nephews. I don't have to follow news. And by the way, if you have a friend who you happen to follow because you like their photos and they share all kinds of nonsense or mind pollution, stop following them. Defriend them. Deal with the inconvenience of them being pissed off that you cut them out of your feed. You can stop sharing things that you didn't actually read. How many of you do that? Be honest. You see something and you get that little dopamine surge and you share it, you friend it, you forward it. Stop. Because you don't even know where it came from. There was one study that said like 60% of things that are shared on the internet people didn't even read in the first place. That's insane. 4, you can try to create your own bionic mind of knowing these things by making that conscious effort to figure out the newsletters, the sites, the platforms that actually will enrich you and help you understand the topics that you need to be able to read. And then finally, you can read Axios. That's what we try to do. Got to get a plug in, for crying out loud. That's what we try to do. It's all we really care about. Like, our whole theory of the case is the world's getting more complicated faster than the human mind is capable of keeping up with, which is going to require all of us to know more across more topics. It's not enough for you just to be a political junkie. You have to, I beg you, learn a little bit about artificial intelligence. Learn about machine learning, because artificial intelligence and machine learning are going to make the internet seem like a flip phone. It is going to be so radical how it affects every dimension of our life. Could be very positive. I can lay out some outcomes where it's not very positive. But really, like, take time to understand, like, China, don't just have a visceral reaction, but understand, like, why has China risen to soak up such a big chunk of the global GDP over the last 10 years, and what consequences does that have for us? That, by far and away, the biggest threat to us long term. And so we appreciate, and in the Q&A, we're happy to go into all this. Mike will give you the fun political stuff.
Thank you, Jim, and just giving you a sense of how I came to this. Jim talked about how we were very traditional journalists. So I was the most traditional type of journalist. When I got out of Washington and Lee, I got a job there used to be something called newspapers. And there used to be something called an evening paper. And so I was in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and we had the city editor there, Nancy Moore, who was the Margaret Thatcher of city editors. And these were the days when you would actually call a phone and someone would pick it up and answer it. And so people would call Nancy Moore, the city editor, who sat right next to me. She would pick up the phone and she'd always say, they'd always have a complaint, and she'd always say, I have the paper right here, what are you talking about? And so while I was there, the evening paper changed to the morning paper. And it turned out that a lot of older people read the paper, and a lot of older people didn't like a change in the schedule of their paper. So all day long, people were calling to complain that the evening paper had become a morning paper. Finally, Nancy Moore got so sick of this that she started telling them, just put it in a drawer. Read it whenever you want. And it worked. They stopped calling. And so that was it was at the Fredericksburg Freelance Star that I started covering politicians. And when I moved down the road to the Richmond Times-Dispatch, one of the first big-time politicians that I covered, Oliver North, who some of you will remember from the Iran-Contra days. I since have covered a lot of politicians who thought they were the colonel. Ollie was the only one, he actually wanted you to call him colonel while we were on the stage. This was 1994, the Newt Gingrich revolution year. Oliver North, I think, was the only person in the entire country with an R after his name who lost his election. He was running for the Senate of Virginia. It turns out that if you're running for senator in Virginia and Nancy Reagan is against you, that's bad. So I definitely finished him off. So there's a great documentary about this race, A Perfect Candidate, and that comes from, there's a preacher in there who tells people there is no perfect candidate, which I think Jim and I can attest to, and then probably some of the people in this room have run. There's a great documentary about the race, A Perfect Candidate. And in this documentary, on election night, when the polls had expected he was going to win, there's this big Republican wave. And I've sneaked up from the press room, we're in a hotel, I've sneaked up to his suite. And I'm outside his suite, and this guy, Mark Merritt, who is his top campaign person, Mark Merritt comes barging out of the door, and Jim will remember, I used to have these huge tape recorders. I was famous for my huge tape recorders. And so I shoved it in Mark Merritt's face, and I said, "How'd he take it?" And Mark Merritt said, "He took it like a man," and kept walking. And so that was the state version of politicians. And then Jim and I started covering your neighbor, Donald Trump. I feel like I'm a Metro reporter again because there's so many people here who've crossed paths with him. And I'm going to debunk a couple things about your neighbor. One, like once in a while you'll hear people say, he hates being president, he doesn't like it, he might quit. He loves being president. Jim and I interviewed him at Trump Tower. Jim interviewed him on Axios on HBO, along with our colleague Jonathan Swan. And I can tell you, he loves being president. So the big room where they bring in CEOs, labor leaders, they do their big meetings, the Roosevelt room. So in his mind, he still thinks of things in terms of reality TV and The Apprentice. And so he calls it the boardroom. And he'll be in the boardroom, and probably just about every person in this room has thought about, how can I make this boring meeting end? Well, Donald Trump has a trick. And so he'll be in the Roosevelt room, he'll have all these people there. He doesn't have the longest attention span. And when he has a trick, when he's tired of the meeting, he says, "Have y'all heard of the Oval Office? Do you want to see it?" And it breaks up the meeting every time. So he takes him to the Oval Office, and one of his favorite things to do there is he has a literal red button. And so people will be talking, like they're gathered around the Roosevelt desk, the Resolute desk, and he keeps, like, he knows, he's a showman, like he knows how to get your attention, right? And so he keeps eyeing the red button, and he'll pick it up, and he's got the people's attention, right? And finally he pushes it, and a Diet Coke comes in. It's how he summons a Diet Coke. He loves The Office. So he had one of your other neighbors, a billionaire, on Air Force One, and he's very proud of the White House, proud of the Air Force One, and so he was showing your billionaire neighbor around Air Force One, and this person, they later were recounting how excited President Trump was to show them the plane, and your neighbor said, I didn't have the heart to tell him. I'd been on the plane before. but he does love showing off. And the other thing that we can debunk is there's this idea that the president promotes that he hates the press and that he's always hated the media. And like, as Jim will tell you from our personal experience, couldn't be less true. The idea of hating the press, the idea of the press as the enemy, there's very much a WWE, WWF dimension to that. Jim mentioned Maggie Haberman. Like, the president will talk on stage about the failing New York Times. He'll walk off the stage and he'll give an interview to Maggie Haberman. And he's a student of the media. Like people in this room remember in the 80s he came out. Like, one of the ways that he built his name, built his fortune, was courting the media. And he's now in a fight with Morning Joe, as you know, and that, by the way, is not fake. That's a real fight. But it wasn't that long ago when he was definitely a friend of the show, as they would say. And this is how specific, how much of a student of the media he is. So a number of people here watch Morning Joe, or Morning Mika, as some people call it. And so it's live from 6 to 9, except from 8 to 8:20, they're in tape. And they replay, it's a restroom break, a coffee break, and they replay the 6 to 6:20 when they've just come on and when they're hottest. Like, who would know that? Who would notice? Who watches all 3 hours? Trump knew. 7:59, Jim and I would be on the set. 7:59, he would start texting Joe and Mika, Barnacle. Like, he knew that they were about to go into tape. And he would not only watch the show live, he continues to, like, who knew there were still TiVo? But he has a TiVo, watches all the Sunday shows. Governor Chris Christie, who's now on ABC, he says that in the car, when he's leaving the studio, the phone will ring, and it'll be Trump, who will be critiquing like what he's just said on ABC. And the only thing that the president likes better than news shows or shows that are talking about him are tapes of himself. So one of the best books that's come out about the Trump administration is by Cliff Sims. Worked on the campaign, worked in the White House. Play on the Doris Kearns Goodwin book, Team of Rivals. Gives you a sense of what the West Wing is like, and I think you heard a little bit about that from Spicy not too long ago. It's Team of Vipers. But anyway, it's a great book. And one of the moments in there is when the president is... I forgot my story.
No, it's where he will be on Air Force One and he'll get to a rally and then he'll come back and he'll be in the cabin and he will rewatch almost like a sports telecaster his own performance, and he'll be like, wait for this.
See what I did there? And so he loves doing that. So when people all kinds of mixed opinions in here, just to cause trouble, I always tell people, don't worry, it's only 6 more years. But Jim was talking about how to see through the fog in the medias, how to be smart about how we consume news. I was just going to have a couple thoughts for you, a counterpart on politics. And before we came in here, we were chatting with Steve and Ann Brown, who are a Republican and a Democrat who are married happily, they both added. And Republican and Democrat, they're still able to stay married and talk about current events in a way that very few people in the country do. That they're so much conflict. And the conflict soaks up so much of the coverage, so much of our bandwidth. Jim talked about like how much politics we consume. And then on top of that, the politics that we do consume is often so much nonsense. Our editor at Axios, Nick Johnston, used the example of, there was a video of President Trump getting on Air Force One with toilet paper on his shoe. And it was everywhere, millions of views. But not on Axios, and not worthy. And I'd encourage you to take the same approach. So the way that we cover politics at Axios, we call it clinical. And that is, we don't love on Trump, we don't hate on Trump. We don't love on tech, we don't hate on tech. We just illuminate, explain, we're wired into both sides. So much of the coverage is so myopic. 28 days to the Iowa caucuses, and so much repetitious coverage. So at Axios, we've taken an approach that we call what matters. What matters? What's worthy of your time? And I'm going to tick off just a couple of issues that I'd love for you to watch the race through this lens, that forget the day-to-day, here they come, there they go. Like if you look at Trump's polls, if you look at the polls in the Democratic race, they're actually quite stable. A lot of the coverage, a lot of what we consume is wasted. So a couple of the issues to pay close attention to, the what matters issues of 2020. Jim touched on mind manipulation by media, and like how much the targeting of online content and online advertising can be used as weapons by politicians and others who either want to confuse, distort, distract. Second, industrial disruption. Jim mentioned the importance of knowing a little bit about AI, knowing a little bit about robotics. Like one of the factors that drove Trump to office, that fueled the Trump presidency, one of the under the radar issues that we paid too little attention to in 2016 was how many people in politically sensitive parts of the country, including his home state, Wisconsin, including Michigan, including Pennsylvania, who's Barbara Noble's home state. In those states, there were so many people who were worried that they were going to lose their jobs to a machine, and that because of that, there was going to be less opportunity in their community, in their state, in their country for their kids. Like a massive issue that still is too little is paid to. China, the economic, military, technical ambitions. If you read Axios AM this morning, Mike's Top 10, which is part of a good breakfast. And by the way, the price is right. It's at signup.axios.com, signup.axios.com. But if you read it this morning, and thanks to those here who did, like we had a great piece in there about the fight between China and America to dominate the 21st century. And it's happening on so many fronts. And the article that we talked about was by Evan Osnos of The New Yorker. He lived in Beijing. He now lives in Washington. It's a piece that's very much worthy of your time. And so much less attention is paid to that here than it is in China, where they're thinking about 2030, 2050. And so much of our coverage keeps us in the dark. And the last topic that I'm going to mention to you, demography is destiny. How much the parties, the country, our politics are changing because of demographics. Just a couple facts that I'm going to throw out for you, and then I'd love to bring you into the conversation. So when today's teenagers are in their 30s, and this is a piece by Axios' Steph Kite, who follows demographics for us as a beat. That's how important we think it is. When today's teenagers hit their 30s, in the United States, there will be more minorities than white people. There will be more old people than young people. And there will be more people practicing Islam than practice Judaism. A second tidbit, and this is the tipping point that we see coming. It's in 2045. just a couple of generations of politics, 2045, that the whole country will be majority, what we now call minority, that white people will be in the minority. And look at this wave. This year, that's true of people under 18. People under 18, by the time that we vote, that will be majority, minority. And a decade from now, that will be true of everyone under 30. So the map, the economy, our politics are changing profoundly. Pay attention to that, and less about toilet paper on the shoe and Sharpies. And now we'd love to have your question, and we've been warned in advance that the toughest questions in the room by far will come from the students. So congratulations on being chosen to be here, and bring it on.
One more last reminder to please hold up your cards.
I don't think your mic's on.
Okay.
One last reminder.
All right, now,
please hold
one
up.
last reminder to hold up your cards so we can come around and pick those up if there's any more questions. But we do have a great stack of questions. So now, Mike and Jim, today's questions, they do come directly from our audience. And these people here are citizen leaders, and they're here to hear the news and information from you. And to kick off this question and answer period, we have our students from Florida Atlantic University. So I'd like to ask our first student to stand and please ask the question. I'll be right in the back.
Hello, my name is Ilse Cruz, and I'm from Florida Atlantic University, and my question is, breaking news seems to be increasingly more important than the accuracy of reporting. How do you compete as a fair journalist when so many platforms are willing to proceed with a story without sufficiently fact-checking?
It's a huge problem. Not to go too deep into like running a media company, but most coverage is derivative, right? Like somebody breaks something and then 1,000 sites say the same thing. It's insane. Like at some point markets will correct, but right now that is the reality. The effect that it has for us as a publisher, it makes the value of breaking news shrink. Right? Because it's only your own unique exclusive scoop for seconds before other people parasitically attach themselves to it, and then you might find it in your feed and think you got it from Facebook or think you got it from the other source other than the original. And so where you get real value now in a good way, breaking news is awesome and being fast as long as you're accurate is great, is in providing like tell me something I don't know. Provide unique set of facts, unique set of figures, unique interviews, unique context. And I think that's where the value is. And that's where like we certainly put most of our resources, but I think the Times and others are doing the same. And I'd say for you, it's just really important to make sure that you come up with a set of either podcasts or publications that you trust, that you've charted over a long enough period of time, that you've seen their accuracy borne out by reality. And once you have that, cherish that and read that and soak that up. Because the thing is, my wife is often like, you can't say what you actually think about where things are headed the next 10 years, because I often have a very dark view. But like, if we don't get this right, as a country, we're screwed. We have 60% of this country that doesn't believe almost anything that our industry produces. And certainly some of that is on us, and I could go through the litany of mistakes that I think the mainstream media has made. But this is a huge problem. We can't end up in a place where we don't even have any shared set of facts. Look what's happening right now. We've launched a missile, we've assassinated a terrorist, a killer, but also a leader of the Iranian regime. What does that require? Forget what you think about the move. It requires now all of us to trust what we're hearing, to trust what we're seeing, because this could escalate into a full-blown war. It could. People could die because of it. And at that point, you've got to put aside the stupid silliness and the triviality of Twitter or Facebook and really get to the point where like we trust what we see, we trust what we read. If we don't fix that, we're going to get played. So imagine that you're the Iranians, the Koreans, the Russians, the Chinese. Why the hell wouldn't you use Facebook and Twitter to try to manipulate and stir up dissent in our communities. And if you made the decision that you're going to do it, is it really that hard to figure out what divides us? Talk about religion, talk about guns, talk about immigration, and we're going to get everyone in this room super stirred up. And then you realize that for a couple of rubles, you can kind of put that stuff at scale. That's a problem. And so we have to figure out, I think relatively quickly, how are we going to fix that? How are we going to get to that where we can trust sort of each other, but we can trust the information that we're reading? I think a lot of that's on us to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to provide you information that you trust. But a lot of it's on the social media platforms to figure out how they can be used for good and not evil. And then it's on all of us in the room to make sure that we understand like what we're consuming and we sort of change the way that we look at it.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Now, if our second student from Nova Southeastern University would please stand, introduce yourself, and share your question.
Hi, my name is Miriam Clovorn. I am currently studying respiratory therapy at Nova Southeastern University. And my question is, Axios often uses short-form news stories in its reporting. Is this the future of news reporting? And is there a space or time for long-form journalism anymore?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Miriam, right?
Miriam, yes.
Yes. So Axios' secret sauce is smart brevity. And where smart brevity came from was when Jim and I and Roy Schwartz, who's the president of Axios and our co-founder, when we were thinking in 2016 about how we could help people get smarter faster, we realized that so much of what was out there was just words, not news, not insight. So the smart brevity architecture, we call it short, not shallow. And that is that we get to the point. We said the first two words of our manifesto are audience first. And what Jim and Roy and I said was, what if we created a news site that was for the audience rather than for the journalist or for the publisher? When Jim was at the Wall Street Journal, when I was in various papers, like being long was a sign that was a serious project. Being long was a sign of status. And what we said is no, that if you can tell people what's new, why it matters, give them the power to go deeper by dropping down or getting more coverage, that is the way our mind is wired. And that is an efficient, worthy way to consume news. So for sure, there is great long content out there, but I will tell you, most long content out there isn't great. And so you need to use some of the tools and hacks that Jim mentioned to point you to long coverage that actually is worthy of your time. I mentioned a piece in the New Yorker that posted today by Evan Osnos about China and the contest between DC and Beijing. Very worthy of your time. But Evan is the rare person who when he talks about China, you want to pay attention to it. He's lived in DC, lived in Beijing. Most people that are typing words about China, not so worthy of your time.
We have another question that I think dovetails with this. So talk a little bit in that answer about balancing brevity with journalistic integrity.
The way we do it is basically, Mike talked about smart brevity. There's two pieces to it. There's the efficiency, but then there's the intelligence.
Right.
So basically where we put all of our investment is whether it's tech deals or AI, climate, healthcare, energy, any topic that will shape the next 5 to 10 years, we hire people who have had a demonstrated record of having subject matter expertise where they're covering something clinically, and that their content is of such high quality that they tend to be read by presidents or CEOs or sort of the leaders in that industry because of the authority from which that they can report and write. And so all you really have is integrity. That's all we've got. Like, we're a new company. You're either going to read us and trust us, or you're going to read us and never come back. And so all we have is that integrity piece. So there's no correlation between length and integrity. Like, you're either honest and transparent in your coverage and accurate, or you're not. And I think that is the trick for all. That's the trick for all publications. And I think when we're at our best, like, we nail that. And not that other publications don't, it's just like one of the dirty secrets of what we did, especially when we had newspapers, is you just had to fill holes. And how often do you read something, you're like, well, that was disappointing. I didn't really learn anything new. And so the way that we stack the architecture of our site is the way I think the human brain consumes information. Tell me what's new, tell me why it matters, and then give me the decision whether or not I can go deeper. When you can go deeper, you can often go very, very deep, especially if you care about that topic and need additional context because you don't have built-in expertise in that topic.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks to our students for the great questions. In a world that is rapidly changing, it's often the most sensational stories that receive the most coverage. What are the stories and issues facing us today that we should be paying more attention to? I think Mike started to address this with the lenses that he shared. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about some of the things we really need to be paying attention to.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jennifer. And the what matters idea that so little of what's written, broadcast, consumed about politics really will change the world. When a lot of successful investors in here, you know that fundamentals matter. You know that a lot of the coverage we get of the markets every day pay little attention to fundamentals, which is the way ultimately to be successful. I want to mention two other issues that are really worth paying attention to. One, we had a piece this morning about climate and how that is getting more attention than it ever has in a political cycle, and rightly so. That at this point, if you don't believe, at this point it's clear human activity is contributing to climate change, and you're seeing more and more candidates who are embracing that. You're seeing more and more voters demand that be covered. But it's such a polarizing issue. It's one where a lot of the facts often get lost, and so that's a place to, as Jim said, to pay attention to trustworthy sources, watch out for the Facebook machine. Another topic that is fascinating and I think is going to get a lot of coverage is because of the increasing inequality, people are looking at reimagining capitalism. You saw the Business Roundtable earlier last year, put out a piece about the duties to people other than shareholders, the duties to their suppliers, duties to their customers, duties to the person who work for them. That's going to be a continuing part of the conversation. And then the last one that I wanted to mention that Axios has a lot of expertise in and that we devote a lot of coverage to is healthcare, and how little of what's covered in the press really reflects what's happening out there. So if you look at what's really happening in healthcare, hospitals, which are the largest part of the healthcare dollar, $1 trillion, pharmaceutical companies, which are the largest part of the profit, and the incentives in the healthcare space are not aligned around getting the best care. So, like, that's coverage that makes sense to pay attention to, but is in very short supply.
Let me add to that on the socialism. I was running to people like, it's America. Like, we would never become socialistic. Are you paying attention to the election? There's I don't think there's like a 50% chance that we move towards socialism, but there's a much higher chance that we move towards socialism than people actually realize. I mean, you think about it, look at where Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are in the polls. Like, they both have a plausible chance of winning the nomination. That's where a lot of the energy inside the Democratic Party is. And if whoever wins that nomination in this country probably has a 50-50 chance of winning the presidency. And if you look at polls, people under the age of 30 have a more favorable impression of socialism than they do of capitalism. Women under the age of 55 are seeing a huge surge, a big uptick in support for socialism. And so there's just a broad rethinking of capitalism. Probably should be a rethinking of parts of capitalism. There's no doubt that inequality is real, that for a huge chunk of America, their wages essentially stagnated for a generation, while the super wealthy got super wealthier. And so there's no doubt that it should be part of a very robust conversation. The second one, to amplify what Mike said about AI. Just the next time you're walking through a main strip where you see a bunch of different stores, just look in every single store and ask yourself about every job that you see being done in there. Could that be done by a robot or a computer more effectively? And the answer is, like, shockingly, like, almost every job can. Well, now think about if you're a CEO of a publicly traded company, you have a fiduciary responsibility to drive shareholder wealth, and so that's why you always turn towards automation. And so the idea that companies are going to not use machine learning, are not going to use AI in almost every single sector is crazy. And so just understanding that, because it's going to affect your job, it's going to affect your community, it's going to affect whatever industry you're in. And again, it could unfold in good ways, but it also could wipe out. I mean, look at the retail sector. Look at all the stores that you used to think about in most communities that don't exist today because of Amazon. I love Amazon. I can order all kinds of stuff. My wife seems to order something every single day that delivers within 24 hours at a pretty low cost. But there's about 10 to 12 different companies that went under business because of their ability to harness technology. That will happen in almost every single space. And the reason you should pay attention to that is that if you think about the populism that you're seeing now, the discontent in a lot of rural communities, a lot of that is traced to sort of economic upheaval that we saw in the Midwest and saw in the Northeast. That basically these awesome paying jobs that existed and sort of basically were able to fund an awesome life for generations, they went away. But that unfolded over 25 years. A lot of these changes are going to happen like that. And the like that is really important to remember. I think it is the #1 reason that we all feel more anxiety today than ever before. It's because everything's changing that fast. Once we got our iPhones, once we had 4G, soon to have 5G, now everything's moving quicker than the human mind can keep up with. And that's going to be true in every single sector.
Thank you. I've got a couple questions about the future of journalism, so let's combine those to talk about where you see the future of journalism and professional journalists along with the local newspaper. What's the future of that?
I mean, I'd like to have an upbeat message on local journalism. I've studied it, I've thought about it. I think if we had a solution for it, we'd probably back it. It's a really hard business. It just is. I think a lot of these papers that are going out of business are not going to be replaced by something else. And I think a lot of newspapers are still going to go out of business. You look at the Gannett's and the McClatchys, they're shrinking, and they're just trying to find some hope for salvation. And there's not a good one, right? Because all of us have been habituated to not pay for content, which might be the stupidest thing that any industry ever did, but we basically habituated all of you by giving it away free 15 years ago. And then, in terms of advertising, if you want to sell a burrito in a local community, Facebook's got some really impressive technology that can figure out within a second whether or not you want a burrito, where you live, what type of burrito you want, and it keeps throwing the damn burrito ad in front of you. That's just more effective than going to a website or going to a newspaper. And I don't know there's two fixes for that. One is the rich people in this room need to fund them. They need to be not-for-profits. I think that is one possible solution. The other is you can do a lot with a little, right? The cost of entry technology is almost nothing now if you want to start a website. And if you can find at least a little bit of funding, you might not have the massive empire that you had in some of these communities before, but you'll still be able to find some coverage. And so I think local journalism has it the toughest. I think the areas that thrive are niche publications, boutique publications. I think one of the reasons that Politico is such a success story is there's an entire cottage industry that feeds off of politics. But that's not going to help those local communities. It's not going to help those states. where I think a lot of the mischief is going to happen because nobody's paying attention. The big will keep getting bigger, which is true in every single industry. Technology is helping the New York Times. It's helping the Washington Post. They're able to utilize that technology to get more subscribers, to get better at the advertising game, and I think the big will get bigger. The middle, like it will, I think, in almost every single sector, will end up getting washed out. You'll either have these specialty things or you'll have big on the end. It's the middle where I would be nervous if that's where I was sitting.
All right, thank you. We have a question about the current partisan tribal landscape and how divisive that's become. Would you say that's going to increase, or that it's, if you look at our country's history, is it a cyclical pattern?
It's going to get worse. Well,
where's the positive message?
you guys, we should serve martinis when we talk. It'll get worse, then it'll get better. The reason that it'll get worse is, like, one of the things you need to remember is that one of the reasons that we're all nuts is because these technologies are babies. If you think about the scope of history, like, we're only 10 to 15 years into having 4G, having an iPhone, having all this connectivity, having Facebook, having Google, having all these different websites that we can choose from. And they're young, and we're kind of dealing with them like we're young. We're behaving like infants, right? Because you got to go back. So you go back 15 years ago when we had normal jobs at normal newspapers. You didn't have that many places you could get information from, right? You might not have liked the evening news, but most of us watched it. You had your local paper, and then you had the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. There just weren't that many places to get that much information. And when you got that information, there's not that much you could do with it. Right? I guess you could go to the PTA and you could scream at people, but most of us just yelled in the basement. Well, all of a sudden, I've got this phone, I've got this Facebook, I've got this Twitter, and guess what? I can say whatever the hell I think about anything, and the louder I scream and the crazier I am, the more people are going to fan and follow me. Well, then guess what happens? It gives you a dopamine response. And the more people fan and follow you, the more you want more of it, right? And so it just keeps coming. And if you don't have enough material to work for, you've got all these cable networks that are built to cater to you. Like, if you're a right-winger and you want to, like, get a little bit of fodder, just turn on Sean Hannity, grab your beer, and he's going to make you feel really good about your conservatism. If you're a liberal, grab your damn Chablis, watch Rachel Maddow, and she'll get you all fired up and self-righteous about your view. So all of these things are swirling simultaneously. And what I would say to people say, it's just going to change. Like, Trump's going to leave and it's going to change. No, Trump is not the cause of this. He's the effect of it. And it's going to live on until we figure out how to control ourselves and how we consume media, when we figure out how to regulate these platforms, when our politicians find some kind of incentive to try to be moderate or try to be in the middle. These things are locked in. It's going to take us years to unwind those. And I'll find something hopeful to say by the end, but that's my honest view of that question.
All right, final question. Everybody ready? The Atlantic Monthly abandoned a 160-year tradition and endorsed Hillary Clinton in the last election. Is there a point at which Axios and Politico would drop their neutral position and support one candidate or another? And how do you balance your personal politics with your job?
No, thank you. That's a great question. We were visiting about this before the event. Spoiler, the answer is no. And so just talk a little bit about how we think about the coverage, and then I'll talk about how I think about my own role in civic life. So on our coverage, we talked earlier about how, like, one of the biggest things that happened after 2016 was that people didn't know what to trust. And Axios is a clean, well-lighted place where you're going to get fair coverage, clinical coverage, where we illuminate, explain, wired on all sides. That's not going to change. That's something that sets Axios apart. It's what makes it worthy of your time and attention. I personally don't vote. There's nothing wrong with journalists voting. Most of them do. The reason I don't, it goes back to when I was in college and I was covering a student council election. And I realized that if I walked in the quad and dropped something in the barrel that the people I'd been covering and trying to be fair to, they'd realize that I'd made up a decision. And so as I've covered local officials, then state officials, then federal officials, like I realized that I wanted to just give everybody a fair shot. And so I don't vote myself. The opposite of this story that you'll enjoy, a friend of ours who covered John Kerry when he was running for Senator of Massachusetts against Bill Weld. A lot of you will remember a classic election. This person was on John Kerry's bus in his van with him every single day, giving him coverage throughout the election. He hated him so much that on the day of the election, he walked up to him and said, "Senator, I just wanted you to know I voted for Bill Weld."
The other thing I would add to that is, listen, like the truth is, like if you, in the newsrooms that I've worked in, I would bet you 90 to 95% are liberal or are left of center. I think that critique is true. I would say at the same time, even in my time at the Post, in the Journal, I can count on one hand the number of times I thought like, God, man, it really seems like you're trying to smuggle your ideology into a story. Like most journalists, I truly believe, do their damnedest to try to get to the closest approximation of the truth. Where journalism falls short is that for whatever reason, the factories, the people who are interested in getting into journalism, they tend to come from the two coasts. They tend to come from more elite schools. And so they don't really have an appreciation for Trump country. I don't think they have an appreciation really for necessarily military service or being a Christian, right? Like it's not their social set. Not that they can't try to understand it, but they don't understand it viscerally. And I think it's one of the reasons that the media missed Trump. I will say most of my family are Trump supporters. I spend a lot of time at home in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and then up in Lincoln, Maine. Most people in my two focus groups are Trump people. And you could, and it's interesting, because like I always say, like my father, I'll leave you with this, like my dad is the reason Donald Trump's president. So I would say he's like a Kasich Republican, like a moderate Republican. And he doesn't really like Trump. Didn't like Trump much at all. And Wisconsin was the swing state, right? And he's like all of us, like he watches Fox News, he watches MSNBC, he soaks his stuff up, partly to humor his kid, partly because he's interested in it. And he calls me the day after the election. And he says, I got to tell you what I just did. And I said, well, you saying that makes me know what you just did. He goes, I voted for Donald Trump. And he said, the reason I did, he goes, I have never prayed harder about anything other than your mom and you three kids than this vote. And I walked in and I was going to write in a name. And I thought that would be cowardly. And he goes, so I voted for Trump because I think the system can handle crazy better than it can handle corrupt. And I think tons of people walked in on election day, regardless of what their views are now, and it was basically their vote was two middle fingers. It was two middle fingers to the media, to the people who are being condescending, talking about sort of their patriotism, their religion, their social views. And I think it was like this cathartic moment where they might not have loved the guy. And there's definitely a lot who voted for him who loved him, but that a big chunk did that. And I think one of the big mistakes the media makes to this day is you turn on Twitter or you turn on TV and I see all these journalists who for my whole life tried so hard to sort of hide their ideology, suddenly exposing it. If you follow their Twitter feed or you watch them on cable, they have the same Trump derangement syndrome that probably a lot of people in this room have. But that's not their job. So no wonder the person out there who might be persuadable, that might believe you're trying to get to the closest approximation of the truth, no longer trust you. And so I'd say it's on us to be able to figure out that. Like, how do I not keep my ideology in it? I've been doing this for 20 years. I'm about as clinical or cynical as you could possibly be. I've seen the warts of both sides. And all we're trying to do is like at least point out the things that we can see that are happening in all these different sectors that you should be aware of so that hopefully you can ultimately make a better decision. And I think that makes it fairly easy to sort of throw ideology to the side. And also, like the last thing I'd say, if reporters, if you wanted to be ideological, you can make a lot more money just being ideological. Like, why go through all of this trying to be not biased and not make that much money? Like, go into politics and make a hell of a lot of money. So.
Thank you, Forum Club.
Yes.
Happy 2020, and see you on Axios.com.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you on February 5th. Happy New Year.
Thank you, Madam President. Really appreciate it. Great question.